concept of foreign aid and international development has been sold to the public as a noble effort, an altruistic mission to uplift developing nations, fight inequality, and stabilize fragile economies. Western nations and economic powerhouses alike have funneled trillions into foreign aid, justifying the spending as a moral obligation. But beneath the surface, international development is little more than modern imperialism dressed in bureaucratic language, a system of economic exploitation designed to pillage nations and punish those that resist financial subjugation. The methods may vary. America wields US aid and the World Bank, China uses its Belt and Road Initiative and United Front operations, and Canada deploys Global Affairs Canada as its tool of influence. But the strategy remains the same. John Perkins' Confessions of an Economic Hitman pulls back the curtain on this scheme. As an economic hitman himself, Perkins was part of a well-oiled system that used fraudulent financial deals, rigged contracts, and diplomatic coercion to trap developing nations in unsustainable debt. The process followed a predictable three-step formula. First, offer massive loans. Financial institutions like the World Bank or US aid-backed lenders provide infrastructure loans to developing countries under the guise of economic growth. These loans come with strings attached, often requiring that recipient nations use Western firms for construction, engineering, and consulting services. In other words, most of the money never actually leaves the lending country. In the case of America, it simply goes from tax accounts in Washington, D.C. into corporate accounts in New York, San Francisco, and Houston. Second, they ensure default. The loans are designed so that the developing nation won't be able to repay them. Economic projections used to justify them are artificially inflated, creating the illusion that these projects will generate enough revenue to service the debt. When the inevitable default arrives, the debtor nation finds itself at the mercy of its creditors. Lastly, extract concessions. Like a loan shark collecting on a debt, the lending country demands payment, often in the form of access to natural resources, strategic military agreements, or control over policy decisions. The target nation is forced to comply, or it risks financial ruin, diplomatic isolation, or even regime change. Perkins highlights Ecuador as a textbook case of this predatory development model. Under the illusion of prosperity, Ecuador took on billions in loans to modernize its oil sector. But the reality was stark. Out of every $100 of oil extracted, $75 went to foreign corporations, and of the remaining $25, most went towards servicing debt. Less than $3, according to Perkins, was left for the Ecuadorian people. Meanwhile, poverty skyrocketed, unemployment soared, and Ecuador became more dependent on foreign lenders than ever before. However, America is not the only one playing this game. While the US and its allies perfected the art of economic subjugation in the 20th century, China has taken the model to unprecedented levels with its Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. Just like America's international development, China's BRI has become a system of economic entrapment, where Chinese corporations and the Communist Party collude to enrich themselves at the expense of developing nations while securing long-term geopolitical dominance. The scheme is shockingly similar to America's. China offers massive loans to developing countries for large infrastructure projects, with the requirement that Chinese state-owned enterprises oversee the construction. However, these projects are riddled with corruption, with Chinese firms artificially inflating costs to siphon off huge amounts of money. The inflated figures are covered up by the Chinese government, and by the time the corruption is exposed, the host nation is drowning in debt with no hope of repayment. Many countries that initially signed on to the BRI later refused to renew their contracts after discovering how deeply the deception ran. Nations like Malaysia, Bangladesh, and Sierra Leone cancelled or downsized projects after realizing the Chinese government and corporations had inflated costs to hide widespread financial fraud. But by the time these governments caught on, the damage was already done. Their economies were burdened with massive debt, and their sovereignty was compromised. A prime example of this is Sri Lanka's Hambantota port. Initially pitched as an economic godsend, the port was financed through Chinese loans and constructed by Chinese firms. However, as with many BRI projects, the cost was deliberately overinflated, ensuring that Sri Lanka would be unable to repay the debt. Once the country inevitably defaulted, China seized control, securing a 99-year lease on the port. This process is a win-win for the Chinese Communist Party and its corporations. The companies steal billions through fraudulent contracts, and when the host nation collapses under debt, China gains control over strategic infrastructure and often political influence over the government itself. This cycle has played out across multiple countries, reinforcing China's economic stranglehold over the developing world. Now let's take a look at Canada and how this scheme is used as a money laundering machine. While Canada doesn't wield as much geopolitical power as America or China, its international development spending isn't about helping struggling nations either. It's a vehicle for laundering taxpayer dollars into the hands of bankers, corporations, and financial elites. At the center of this operation is Mark Carney, Trudeau's longtime financial advisor and a key architect of Canada's globalist financial agenda under Agenda 2030. As a former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, Carney has shaped financial policies not for the benefit of Canadians or Brits, but to align with the interests of the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, or WEF, and the financial oligarchy that controls global markets. A prime example of this corruption is Brookfield Asset Management, where Carney held a senior leadership role while advising Trudeau. Brookfield profits from Canada's foreign aid and climate policies in two key ways. First, it is financially invested in foreign oil markets such as Nigeria, a nation that Canada imported $3 billion in oil from in 2024, despite Nigeria's abysmal environmental standards. Second, Brookfield is one of the largest investors in Canada's renewable energy sector, which has been propped up by taxpayer-funded green initiatives, all while Trudeau kneecaps domestic oil and gas production. This is market manipulation on an unprecedented scale. Carney's firm benefits both from the destruction of Canada's domestic energy industry and the government's reliance on foreign oil markets where Brookfield has financial stakes. Canadian taxpayers are being forced to bankroll their own economic decline, while Carney and other financial institutions profit from both ends of the scam. This isn't just corruption, it's a deliberate, systematic looting of the nation's wealth. Another unsavory aspect of foreign aid is how it is often used for ideological subversion. Even by Trudeau's own standards, Canada's funding of foreign activism and protests is a threat to democratic principles. Consider the following. Trudeau justified freezing bank accounts and using police force against the Freedom Convoy by falsely claiming it was foreign funded and a threat to Canada's democracy and sovereignty. Meanwhile, Canada openly funds foreign protests that serve its geopolitical interests. Take the Renewed Women's Voice in Leadership program, a $25.2 million initiative funding feminist and LGBTQ activist groups in developing nations. While the government and state-funded media paint these programs as acts of altruism, in reality they serve as destabilization tools. By financing ideological activism in strategically significant nations, Canada undermines local governments and influences political shifts favorable to progressive international interests. This mirrors classic tactics used in US foreign policy, using civil society as a Trojan horse to infiltrate and manipulate foreign regimes. If Ottawa truly believed in the sanctity of sovereignty and democracy, it wouldn't be funding ideological activism abroad while ruthlessly suppressing dissent at home. Foreign aid isn't about development, it's about control. It's a mechanism for funneling taxpayer wealth from around the world into the hands of global elites, while ordinary people, both at home and abroad, remain trapped in cycles of poverty, debt, and political instability. The sooner we recognize international development for what it truly is, the modern face of imperialism, the sooner we can dismantle the illusion that these programs serve anything other than economic warfare. Only then can we demand accountability for the trillions in stolen tax dollars around the world, extracted from working citizens in the developed world, repurposed to subjugate developing nations, and all the while wrapped in a facade of humanitarianism.